Hey students, I hope you're all doing well. In this slideshow, we will discuss Native American languages and issues facing Indigenous language communities. First of all, who are Indigenous people? Like, what does that even mean? And I put here just some images that tend to be somewhat familiar to the minds of most North Americans when we think of Indigenous people, or an older term, Indians, right? So we have kind of an old fashioned, older photo on the left, a more modern photo with modernized trappings and a kind of revitalized effort at ceremonial practices in the center. And then again, a modern photo of Indigenous folks living in northern Canada and living in many ways similarly to how their ancestors did many generations ago, but with some modern trappings. And first off, I want to say that there's a known challenge to discussing Native American communities and indigenous communities all over the world. First, because of terminology, and so how do we define, who are indigenous people? Here are a few definitions that you can read: Encyclopedia Britannica. Um, Indigenous peoples, also known as First Peoples, Aboriginal peoples, or Native peoples, are ethnic groups who are the original owners and caretakers of a given region, in contrast to groups that have settled, occupied, or colonized the area more recently. So, in the scheme of things, we're talking about folks who inhabited a place before the arrival of Western peoples. In the United Nations definition, Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. So the United Nations definition is capturing commonalities across Native or Indigenous cultures um, about their worldview, their way of thinking, and their minority status, which is at times frequently at odds with sort of more modern Western worldview status, dominance, and ways of doing things. So already we have a challenge in choosing our terminology. We see at the bottom of this slide some other names: Inuit, Eskimo, Aboriginal, Indian, and these all have different connotations. There is a struggle both within communities and outside of communities, or disagreements about which of these terms is appropriate or which of these terms might be offensive. It's complicated. Um, just to be totally clear, where did the term Indian come from to refer to folks that by anyone's observation, are not actually from the continent known as India, right? So Europeans at the time of Christopher Columbus referred to all South and East Asia as India, or the Indies, and then Columbus carried a passport in Latin, a language of commerce and instruction during his time. And this passport it was an official document from Spanish monarchs that gave him permission to go toward the regions of India on their behalf on a well funded journey of exploration. And when he landed in parts of North America, Columbus referred to the resident folks that he encountered there as Indians, reflecting his belief that he had reached the Indian Ocean via a westerly route. And of course, the name stuck. Um, but the historical traditional use of the term Indian has also been adopted to this day as a name which many tribal elders have known all of their lives. It's familiar to them, and so their families continue to use the familiar term. So this can be a sticky subject when you hear North American Native peoples using the word Indian of a certain generation. You'll find many folks who want to be called Indian, whereas their descendants, the younger generations, their grandchildren, reject that name because it came from Western explorers and it is just a wrong. It was just a mistake, right? So it's their thinking is that it has no place. Um, but again, these elders, for them, it's a matter of tradition, of history. It's familiar to them. And then in other communities, the word Indian may be used within the community, but is not fair game for folks outside of the community to use. So this is a very, very sticky subject. Again, younger generations of Native folks. Can reject words like Indian or even Eskimo, for instance, um, with an association that the terms are quaint or pejorative. Okay, um, and there are many other terms that are perceived of as racist when applied to Native American communities. So here is a very basic map of North American indigenous regions. The word indigenous is used by social science to designate populations that were in a place previously. And in many cases, of course, indigenous can refer to plants and animals um, that originate in a particular place. So in many cases, indigenous peoples are kind of the earliest known inhabitants of a particular region geographically. Okay, and so here we have a map of groupings of indigenous regions. So First Nations inhabitants of North America. Geographically, we can identify the subarctic, and we think, to the best of our knowledge in social science research, that these regions correspond to trade routes, routes of migration and settlement, cultural delineation. So that is everything from language, religion, other cultural practices, ethnicity in some cases. Um, so we have the subarctic northern region, the plains, plateaus, Great Basin, southwest, southeast, northeast, and then we have some coastal regions that have retained distinct identities within indigenous known populations. And here, this is far too small. This is an attempt to look at communities, like smaller pockets of communities that have a shared, more recent heritage and identity. I'll skip to this slide that is a graphic showing actual languages spoken and the disbursement of those populations. Many of these languages have dwindling numbers of speakers, but they might be spread over a very large geographical territory, as we see here. So there are speakers of Canada, the language Canada, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, um, across vast territories in Canada, the country. Iroquoian languages stretch, again, a very large territory across many states in the northeastern United States, for instance. Okay. Salish um, is spoken in a long arc from Canada to the northwestern United States. So, I think one thing that folks get curious about when you don't have friends or family members who are tribal members is who gets to claim tribal membership. Um, and it depends. This is actually complicated, and the status of groups in terms of legal national um, sovereignty is kind of in question. It too is complicated. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But there is such a thing as tribal nations that one can have um, membership in. And the rules for determining whether or not a person can be a member are different from nation to nation or group to group. So, for example, in the Cherokee Nation, my most recent information is that membership is determined in a laboratory through a blood analysis. And what the elders are looking for a prospective member is a blood quantum of 1/4 or higher, and is limited to persons on the list of members identified. Um, and so this is a rather strict control of who can and cannot be sort of a recognized official member of the Cherokee Nation. Another example I have here is Chippewa Cree in Articles of Membership. This is a descendancy membership situation. So all children born to any member of Chippewa Cree tribe um, are and who are residents of the reservation at the time of birth are tribal nationals. All children of one half or more um, Indian blood, as per the legal document, um, are also tribal nationals. So, if a tribal group is recognized by the federal government and forms a nation, does it get to have complete self autonomy? Does it have a set of laws and governance that is completely independent from this federal government? That is complicated, and in both Canada and the United States, as examples, there have been many court cases to determine sort of who has jurisdiction when determining laws, um, restrictions of people, citizenship of tribal members. Um, in a couple of cases from the 70s and 80s, tribal sovereignty is dependent on and subordinate to only the federal government, not states, under Washington versus Confederated Tribes of Colville Indian Reservation. That was in 1980. Tribes are sovereign over tribal members and tribal land under United States versus Missouri in 1975. So it would seem that tribes in several cases have been recognized to exist distinctly and autonomously, and not under state government but under federal government. In another example, federally recognized tribes are those Native American tribes recognized by the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs for certain federal government purposes. And in Canada, Indigenous law refers to the legal traditions, customs, and practices of Indigenous peoples and groups. Canadian Aboriginal law provides certain constitutionally recognized rights to land and traditional practices. A major area of Aboriginal law involves the duty to consult and accommodate. So, while Indigenous groups, while tribes are under the jurisdiction of federal governments in Canada and the United States, it would seem, particularly in the case of Canada, but also the United States, bureaus of tribal affairs are put in place to acknowledge and recognize the relative independence of those groups. So they do have kind of a special status at the very least. But I think it's important to note that the interpretation of authority and control are different on both sides of things. So, from the point of view of tribal elders, the first authority is always the tribal council and the tribe first. Whereas from the point of view of large federal governments, the first authority, the first point of control and laws is the federal government. So that story has not been completely told. It remains to be seen what will take place. Let's talk a little bit about language. There is an old research debate among linguists about the origins of North American languages and questions about the extent to which these far reaching diverse languages are related or are not related. And we do have to take into account what we know about prehistory and archaeology and the migration patterns of ancient um, tribal folks. And so we have two kind of opposing camps. One sort of anthropological vein of study suggests a single or near single origin of all North American native languages. Um, so something like an ancestor language, which has been called Amerind, meaning like Amerindian, would be the kind of proto language that later turned into all or most of today's North American languages that are spoken. And then the other camp is in complete disagreement with Joseph Greenberg's and supporters' idea of a single origin, and the claim after studying the grammars, lexicon, all these linguistic traits of North American languages, the conclusion is that there's no single origin. So both of these opposing camps are still in play. They're still valid. And as new archaeological or linguistic evidence is uncovered, either side gets a chance to argue for their way of thinking. I want to say just a few things about some interesting language structures that have been documented when studying some of these languages. We have a common occurrence of velar, uvular, and pharyngeal, so deep, far back sounds, articulated speech sounds in the phonetics of multiple languages. And that includes glottalized stops, affricates, and ejectives. So, some very interesting speech sounds that are frequently found in many of these different languages that we've studied. In terms of morphology and syntax, polysynthesis is common. And what that means is that whole, very long words can function as complete sentences or large portions of sentence level grammar for a language like English, by contrast. And many languages that linguists have studied encode evidentials. These are grammatical expressions that represent the speaker's source of information. And it seems to be this important semantic feature of many Native American languages, which is kind of proving the validity of a statement. And it kind of gives the sense that encoded in the language is is this sense of the importance of truthfulness, and such that, like, in order to make utterances grammatically, you have to prove the truthfulness or the source of where you got information. And this can occur morphologically. So you might have affixes that encode a category of source. Okay, again, sort of proving the validity of a claim or a statement or a declarative sentence. So one affix could mean firsthand personal experience. Another affix could almost be like a disclaimer. Attached to an utterance to admit that the utterance was hearsay, okay, and therefore maybe not the most reliable source of information. Another affix could code for nonverbal auditory evidence. And another affix could imply that the information is based on inference from other evidence. So that is a really interesting feature of these languages that we don't see in a lot of other language families. A common lexical category in North American languages is that of animate versus inanimate nouns. And these appear to be arbitrary grammatical categories, similar to grammatical gender in a language like French or Spanish, where again, the example of French, there's nothing actually feminine about a table. It's purely a grammatical label that all nouns are encoded for either masculine or feminine. And so, similar to that, all nouns in many North American languages are encoded for animate versus inanimate. And then when you try to apply some sort of internal logic to that, it doesn't always work the way you might expect. So here are some animate examples in the Cree language. So things that are encoded for animate status are things like bear, tree, friend, snow, rock. Okay, so a rock is an animate thing, or snow is an animate thing. Um, Whereas inanimate examples in the Cree language are things like mud, fire, water, or an egg, which, an egg seems like it could be animate. So, again, these are probably purely grammatical categories and not to be interpreted as um, literal categories claiming that certain things are alive, um, animate, or not alive, inanimate, but it is interesting. And then finally, anthropologists have identified key fundamental differences between worldviews of indigenous cultures versus Western cultures. And this is from a really great website called the ICTI, which helps promote academic pursuits from Native Indigenous cultures. And I want to share this quote with you. The root of difference between the worldviews is that they generally subscribe to opposite approaches to knowledge, connectedness, and science. Indigenous cultures focus on a holistic understanding of the whole that emerged from the millennium of their existence and experiences. Traditional Western worldviews tend to be more concerned with science and concentrate on compartmentalized knowledge and then focus on understanding the bigger related picture. So, this is an articulation of a claim that there's a fundamental difference between the way indigenous cultures and Western cultures approach the world. Um, that is very interesting. It means that they have a very different way of seeing things. One sort of metric that I found elsewhere to distinguish between an indigenous approach to the world and a Western approach is the following. So, an indigenous person may agree with the following statement: I accept that things are the way they are because my family tells me, and their elders told them, and their older elders told them, etc. We learn first about a broad, interconnected schematic system. Then we learn to identify examples and details within that system. Okay? And then here, in contrast, is a proposed Western worldview that supposedly many Westerners can agree with. And it is the following: I accept that things are the way they are because I see concrete physical evidence with my own eyes. We first learn examples and details of a system. Then we put that data together to extrapolate the broad whole of it. So these are very interesting contrasts and sort of parametric differences that have linguistic, cultural, and identity consequences for these different groups living among each other. In terms of the health and vitality and outlook of Native American indigenous languages, it's what you might expect. Many the of the languages spoken in North America have small groups of speakers and are therefore endangered. About 175 languages are still spoken in North America today, and these languages have the largest numbers of speakers: Cherokee, Dakota, Yupik, Inuktitut, Ojibwa, Cree, and Navajo. So, actually, for your assignment, I want you to pick one of those and just do an internet search, do answer a few questions about it. So, find out some basic things about um, the demographics of the speakers. So, where are they? How many speakers are there in that particular community? What does the community do to reinforce and transmit the language to new generations? What resources do they have at their disposal? And what are some projections about the health of the language in the next 10, 20, 30 years? Okay.